sing about love, some people sing about war, some people sing about a better world to come. Well, I sing about all three, and this is my theme song, waiting for the great leap forward. It may have been Camelot for Jack and Jacqueline, but on the Hugo Chavez highway, filling up with gasoline. Little Donald Rumsfeld spies a rich lady who's crying over luxury's disappointment, so he walks over and he's trying to sympathise with her, but he thinks that he should warn her to prepare to be bombed back into the Stone Age. Soviet Union, the citizens demand to know why they're still the target of strategic air command, and they shake their fists in anger and respectfully suggest we take the money from our missiles and spend it on our hospitals instead. It's over, but the stakes are getting higher. I'm frightened of collateral damage and a friendly fire, and I don't believe we can defeat no axis of evil by putting smart bombs in the hands of dumb people. And politics, they ask me what the use is. I offer them my acupuncturist, my masseuses, while looking down the corridor out to where my ego is waiting. I'm looking for the new world order. Sales are organised, all my mates got fat. Even after all this time, you can still send me a fax. You can be active with the activists or sleeping with the media while you're waiting for the great leap forwards. Yeah. One leap forwards, 2 leaps back. Will YouTube give MTV the sack? Waiting for the great leap forwards. Well, here comes the future and you can't run from it. You've got a tattoo, Henry, I want to be on it, mate. Waiting for the great leap forwards. In a perfect world we'd all sing in tune, but this is reality, not American Idol. Waiting for the great leap forwards. So join the struggle while you may. The revolution's just an ethical haircut away when you're waiting for the great leap forwards.
You're on mute, Tim.
Welcome everybody to Castlemaine Commons. As I just bring up my run sheet. Hello, I'm Tim Adam and I'm the host for tonight. The Castlemaine Collective is a small group of local Castlemaine people that are formed in response to the rapidly changing situation with the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on our community. We have noticed the fundamental disruption of forms of life that the pandemic is causing and I guess also exposing in how we live our lives, and the need to step up and lead the discourse and pose fundamental questions about the way that we live in the long run. So at Castlemaine Commons, we aim to foster connections, make sense of what is happening, catalyse action and create our local future. Welcome to Castlemaine Commons, a YouTube channel hosting weekly conversations. So before we get into it, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the land of the Jaro people and the Dja Dja Wurrung Nation, and also acknowledge elders past, present, emerging, and any Aboriginal people who might be present in the audience. So this week we'll be looking at the pandemic and how this has intersected with our dominant notions of neoliberal economics. Although the last 30 years has seen the dominance of neoliberal economics driving policy, there's been a resurgence of people and organisations on the ground in communities who actively develop other ways that we can live in this world that promotes the environment, a community and a kinder way of living. I would like to introduce our gaggle of guests here tonight. We've approached them and they've spent time to come on tonight. I'd like to first introduce Tammi Jonas, who is a resident Meatsmith at Jonai Farms, where she and her family raise pasteurised heritage breed large black pigs and speckline cattle. I wish I knew what a speckline cattle was. I'll have to talk to you about that later. In the Central Highlands of Victoria. The farm embraces a degrowth as a philosophy to ensure sufficiency for all. And the Jonai are embedded in many solidarity economies in their open, connected and deeply localised community. Tammi is also president of the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance and a regional leader for the International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty, and regularly attends meetings for the Food and Agricultural Organisation of the United Nations, as well as many other UN governing bodies. I'd also like to introduce you to Anitra Nelson. So she is an activist scholar focusing on sustainable community-orientated futures, specifically money-free economies. Active at a local level at the Mount Alexander Eco-Housing Group, a working group of Mount Alexander Sustainability Group, as well as a climate justice group such as XR. She is also an Associate Professor, Honorary Principal Fellow at the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, University of Melbourne, and has got a number of key books under her belt, including Exploring Degrowth, a Critical Guide, out in a couple of months, Housing for Degrowth in 2018, Small is Necessary, Sharing, Living on a Shared Planet, 2018, Life Without Money, 2011, and Marx's Concept of Money, the God of Commodities, 1999, a creative writer. I'd also like to introduce Warwick Smith. So Warwick is an economist, writer and policy analyst. He is a co-founder and economist at the Casualisation Institute. His current professional interests include employment, inclusive and sustainable economic development, democracy and climate change. He also has a background in evolutionary and conservation biology. He writes for The Guardian, The Age and The Conversation, and an honorary fellow at the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne and a research fellow at the policy think tank Per Capita. I would like to also introduce Vicky Anderson, who's a Cultural Development Officer at Mount Alexander Shire Council, long-standing interest in cultural sustainability. Vicky is a qualified arts and change manager drawing 20 years experience, including policy and governance, corporate and business strategy, portfolio and program management, marketing communications, creative development, audience research and development and stakeholder management. Key career highlights include 4 years as Parks Victoria's Senior Strategic Planner, where she implemented a renewal for their first 10-year strategic planning framework, and is a marketing manager for Scotland's largest festival for contemporary art, the biennial Glasgow International, which is online right now. So welcome everybody. It's going to be a very interesting show tonight. So I think it'd be probably best to kind of start up with saying, what is this current economic orthodoxy, this neoliberalism? And I guess, you know, we always hear about all the good about that it's meant to give us around trade deals. And, you know, if we give, you know, if we give big companies money, it'll get down to its workers and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, what's the bad and the ugly about this? And I'm wondering if Anitra, you could start off on this.
Neoliberalism, I sort of think, is really just advanced capitalism. It's a culture and government that has a tendency to eliminate anything that isn't capitalist. So there is no alternative. It's quite totalitarian. The market rules. And that's why government and democracy is so weak today.
Great. Warwick, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, perhaps just to add to that, that I think that, you know, the neoliberal paradigm differs from what was before it, which was, I guess you'd characterise as Keynesianism in terms of economic management, in that there's a sort of movement against government involvement in the economy, in people's lives, in business. And so, you know, we saw when neoliberalism really took hold, which began in the 70s, but really, you know, got into sort of a head of steam in the 80s and 90s, we saw the sell-off of lots of government enterprises and sort of idea that the government just makes things inefficient and should get out of the way. So I think that's an important addition to what Anitra said in relation to contrasting neoliberalism to what came before it.
And it is about that, you know, conception of the individual desire as being the primary importance. There's not a lot about community or environment. Tammi, would you have anything to add?
I mean, I think those two have defined it all quite well, but I think that final point that you're making, Tim, about the individualist kind of nature of neoliberalism is really important, and why even if you go back to earlier capitalism, there was a lot more communalism in the system, and now it's largely lost. And so we actually do kind of need to throw the baby out with the bathwater on this one, because it's got no redeeming features left as far as I can see.
And it's not what's been forever. I mean, it's kind of pasted, this is what should be forever, but it's not what's been forever. And, you know, I'm thinking of some Indigenous, you know, ways of business and living, which, you know, were here well before most of us got here. So, yeah. So I'm wondering, what are we seeing on the ground around the diversity of experience with the pandemic and lockdown? And I guess I'm interested in, Vicky, from the council's perspective, what are we seeing in terms of the kind of damage that's happening because of the pandemic, or but there could also be some good things that are happening?
Yeah, sure, Tim, thanks. I might link that answer to the previous question a little bit, actually, in terms of how I, not being an economic development expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I certainly come with a lens around environment and culture. And I associate that with it only being about value for money, and that we've lost sight of a sense of other values through neoliberalism around, for example, culture and trees, for example. There might actually just be a value in how it makes us feel. And so I think that us all having to pause and stop, let alone enjoy our gardening or enjoy listening to music and reading books again, it's making us realise that there is real value. We might not be able to put a dollar figure on it, and that's the challenge for us all, but it has been the falsity of the previous economic models that really does have to shift. And so that we've got a desire, I'm absolutely seeing that right across and hearing it right across every conversation I'm having, is a different way of valuing our communities. And we can certainly extrapolate that in terms of the conversations that are being having around our health workers and our teachers, for example. I think that's the really interesting shift that's underway. In terms of local businesses, we've had Economy and Culture Unit at Council, and that is the unit that I work within, and that encompasses economic development, cultural development and tourism marketing, which was certainly of interest to me to see that Council, what appealed to me about the job, that Council was putting value on culture, if you like, in preceding comments noted, but that really when we go out as a team, which we really have done through this crisis, as opposed to siloing our service to the community, it's drawn focus on the areas where we really have strengths in an integrated service approach. And so we've put out a survey out to the community, to business and creatives, and asked for their input in terms of what are their responses. Our fabulous line manager, David Leatham, manager of Economy and Culture, sent me some of the top line results, which it is still open, that survey, and I do really encourage our community to input into that. You will find it through the Mount Alexander Shire website, COVID-19 sites. But certainly what I read into the responses is that the impacts are very much defined in terms of business as usual impacts. So 80% of businesses are reporting loss of trade, for example. 5% seeing no change, 5% indeed seeing an increase in business. And that also encompasses sole traders, for example, and some of our larger businesses, so we haven't got the data broken down. But certainly there's an interesting analysis around the reach out for government assistance, where 30% of our respondents, and we've had over 100, well over 100 now, which is starting to get up there, which is great, gives us a good picture, but 30% have successfully received government assistance to date. 4% only have been unsuccessful. 30% still waiting to hear, but interestingly, 38% haven't applied. And I think that really speaks to the shift underway from the individual need and ability to cut it through your own work, and actually where there is a need now to reach out for collective support and quite a different kind of policy space for our federal government.
And I guess what I'm seeing on the ground is, you know, also casual workers. There's a lot of casual workers who don't have jobs at the moment. There are some people who've got lots of lots of work. Like if you're working at the supermarket, you're probably overworked at the moment.
It's obviously, in terms of the arts, culture and creative industries, which is my remit, you know, other than our web developers, we're just completely in hibernation at the moment. However, people are really taking the time to think around new ways of operating. And what's exciting me most of all, and it's a conversation that's been going on well and truly before COVID-19, is how do we work better together? And that's what the crisis is, providing an opportunity for people who are in this very new space where they really are helpless. It's actually the need to reach out, get help and help others, and that there's strength in that collective.
Anybody else like to comment around what they're seeing on the ground in their circles around the effect of the pandemic on business? And I know I might start with you, Tammi, because you've spoken in our previous conversations. You spoke about how it actually, in some ways, increased business in your area, in your community, your farms.
Yeah, I mean, I think for most small-scale farmers, the demand for our food has definitely gone up. And in our case, you know, we're a community-supported agriculture farm with 80 households that are subscribed to receive our meat for the year. And that's been over, like, we've had a waiting list for a number of years. So we can't fill the increased demand, and we don't seek to. But when they come to us, we're able to then send them to other farms who still have capacity to feed them. And that's been a definite increase in numbers of people saying, where can I get something like what you have? Because I know I can't get it from you. I know that some CSAs here in the district who were not full filled up very quickly after the pandemic hit. And that was great news for them, because they've been finding it hard to get people to commit to the system. And this led to much greater willingness to commit to their food security when they realized that the industrial system wasn't as food secure as one might think from looking at cold shelves. So the demand is definitely there for our kind of produce. And the biggest limitation for the small scale farmers has been that those who've sold through farmers markets, many of them have lost their markets. But not all, because it's a council by council matter. And some councils, I mean, what's the short word for it? They freaked out and went for shutting them down instead of following the same protocols as any other place that sells food, where you just have to do social distancing and things. You know, an open air market is much safer, we know that, than an enclosed supermarket. And yet it's the farmers markets that got closed in many cases. Happily not all, though. And so things like the Open Food Network have done a great job of onboarding farmers to sell online through their open source, sort of not-for-profit online shop. And it's been nice to see farmers find that outlet when they lost their markets. So I hate that word pivot. I'm pretty not into it at the moment, but we have seen some really excellent moves from people figuring out how to get their food to people.
And this kind of, you know, I'm wondering whether Warwick and Anitra, you can answer this, but there's a sense of this increased casualisation and, you know, work being much more precarious in this kind of driven, you know, kind of driving neoliberal system where we need to create workers for jobs and they need to be cogs in a machine. But we're also seeing the pandemic kind of opening that up, where suddenly you've got a whole lot of people who aren't secure. And in this debt-laden kind of machine that kind of demands debt in order to meet your desires, then there's this kind of, you know, suddenly people are much more precarious than what they might have been, say, 30 years. Are you seeing any of that or noticing that, Warwick or Anitra?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to follow on a bit from what Tammi was saying, in that there's a sense that, you know, the actions that are being taken by the federal government, at least, well, and in fact also by some councils in terms of farmers markets, tend to favour the big operators, the sort of big businesses who've got in-house accountants and can do the JobKeeper thing really easily. And, you know, I've spoken to businesses around here who have just found the JobKeeper application process too onerous, and, you know, getting their staff to sign up for it, or people, you know, some of their staff have got casual jobs with other employers, and that employer's already signed up for it. And so there's this sort of complexity that, as you say, does count against people who have insecure employment. And right now, the sort of doubling of the dole has sheltered sort of a lot of people from the direct impact of that. But the government is determined that these measures are going to be temporary, and I think it's extremely unlikely that they'll be convinced to extend these payments sort of in the form they are in beyond the 6 months they've stated. And they are even talking about rolling them back earlier. So I think the sort of serious impacts on people's financial well-being we'll see when those measures stop. So they may not be hitting really hard right now. They're hitting some people very hard right now, of course, but there'll be a sort of massive increase in that when those measures are rolled back. But yeah, I definitely see, you know, the treatment of farmers markets in some places where we've had, I think, Bendigo and Ballarat and various other places where farmers markets have been closed, when the supermarkets haven't been, as Tammi said, it's kind of, it's ludicrous, really. And it's just about not, you know, there's this farmers market thing that we don't really know about. We understand supermarkets. We, you know, as you know, as Tammi said, kind of freaking out. But also it's, you know, there are people who think it's this sort of hippie thing, and I've never really liked it. And it's their opportunity to bag farmers markets and talk about how, you know, they're down there spreading COVID, even though the situation in the supermarket might be worse.
Yeah. Anitra, have you noticed anything or come across anything?
Well, if you look at what the government is now forecasting in terms of unemployment, it's that this will be a problem until 2024. And so it's far from a short-term emergency. I suppose some of the kinds of schemes that degrowthers and other alternative economists would be looking at is we should be sharing the work. Like, if we haven't got enough work for everyone, let's all do 3 days or 4 days work, everyone works, okay? We just share. This is, you know, it's a no-brainer, and immediately we have a different kind of situation if we do that.
So that's a great lead, Anitra. Thank you very much, around that kind of moving beyond the kind of Keynesian kind of response, saying, well, the government should be funding big projects. The government should be, you know, talking a bit more around, you know, raising the New Start allowance and all that kind of stuff. I guess, you know, moving beyond that Keynesian response and that kind of degrowth and, you know, other models that we have around, can you talk a bit more around that kind of degrowth model for me, please, Anitra?
Yeah, well, degrowth is really about quality of life rather than quantity. So a growth economy is very much about quantity. It's about money making more money. And that's the driving force. And one of the real problems in capitalism is that it can only exist on the dynamic of growth. There are really no operating principles to remain steady state or to go backwards. And at the moment, we're really, climate change and carbon emissions are the tip of the iceberg of the environmental crises that we're facing. And in order for us to live within Earth's limits, and as a whole planet, we're going towards now 2 Earths. And in Australia, the average Australian is using the equivalent of 4 Earths. We actually need a kind of economy that can operate according to our basic needs and within the Earth's limits. So we're looking at building an economy that's producing locally and for local needs. And that way, it's much more achievable for small communities to be able to see their impact on the Earth and to share what they're producing.
So Tammi, you've got this farm and you say that you work from a degrowth model. What does that look like on the ground for you? I mean, what, you know, on the everyday kind of, how have you organised things? How have you made decisions?
I mean, from the beginning, we called ourselves a no growth model. We knew we wanted to grow the right amount of animals on this land that was suitable for its ecological carrying capacity. And we knew that that needed to be have an economic sufficiency for us to live on. But, you know, we're huge proponents of frugal abundance. And so our needs are not great. It's very easy for us to have a sufficient lifestyle because we grow a lot of our own food and we don't have consumable requirements in our life. Like we, you know, I normally am wearing a scarf that's falling to pieces or something because you just don't need to replace things until they fall off you. So those philosophies drove the establishment of the farm to not take more than the land could provide and not more than the humans wanted to provide to have a happy life, and not take more than our share of the farming capacity of the region. So making sure we're supporting other farmers to also do what we do and supply some of the need for the exact same produce, you know, in the case of pork and beef. And what that means to us is we found our ecological carrying capacity and then we backed off from it. So we grow less animals now than we did 2 years ago because there are small scale farmers entering the space that we want to support because we're working hard enough and we're earning enough and we don't need to earn any more, because those 2 drought years which were not as bad here as up the East Coast, but they gave us the really late autumn break. So nothing grew over winter and we went into springs in a bad position, made us worry about whether our ecological carrying capacity was diminishing. And even though we hadn't seen that yet, we thought, well, let's be prepared for whatever the climate change future looks like here. So it's like an every Monday morning meeting. We're a huge community here. So there are like 9 of us living on the farm at the moment, between live-in staff and volunteer residents and family. And because of lockdown, you know, girlfriends and boyfriends, it's a really big community here at the moment. And our day-to-day life is conversations about how are we doing the most responsible thing by this land? Are we, what else can we do for our CSA members, some of whom lost their jobs? So how can we keep them fed without going broke ourselves? How's everybody's workload feeling? You know, do you want to pass that? We've created all these rosters. We're very organized. The pandemic has made us very organized. We have meal rosters, we have feed rosters, we have boning room rosters, and everybody gets, you know, equal amounts of downtime and go time. That's what it looks like for us. And it feels pretty radically, frugally abundant.
Yeah. Warwick, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I guess I would like to present maybe a slightly different viewpoint. I have a bit of a problem with the degrowth framing, I suppose, and paradigm, in that you know, we've got a current system which is obsessed with growth and which it decides that growth is a necessity. And I do feel like there's a sort of inclination in the degrowth talk to say, well, we've got this obsession with growth and that's bad, therefore we should oppose it and go for degrowth. And you know, personally, I'm growth ambivalent. So I think if we have an economy and society that's regenerative and is repairing the damage that we've done both socially and environmentally, and it's growing, that's fine. If it's steady state, that's fine. If it's shrinking, that's fine as well. So long as we're meeting those sort of core objectives of, you know, restoring the environment and where there's sort of social justice, and we're kind of building black-white relations, and then I just don't care if the economy is growing or shrinking. And I think it's a strange thing to have a shrinking economy as a goal in itself. It seems to me as strange as having growth as a goal. I understand that in many respects, to achieve our goals, we have to reduce certain types of economic activity. I think there's no doubt about that. But you know, if we could miraculously transform the economy to stop using things but actually provide more different services, and the economy itself is growing, you know, I'm okay with that. I mean, there is another kind of radical step that says that the whole way we measure growth is, you you know, even measuring growth is a sort of pointless exercise, right? So I think GDP doesn't really tell us anything. So why does shrinking it tell us anything?
Well, that's exactly right around the kind of, I think, around the issues around GDP, because if, you know, we have a whole set of bushfires and suddenly we put a whole lot of money in, and GDP might go up, but that doesn't mean that we've actually gained anything as an economy. Tammi, I noticed you put up your hand before.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to just say, in terms of when we think about growth, and I know, Warwick, that you know this, but I guess to introduce into the conversation, when we think about growth or scaling and those sort of things, it's about scaling out, not up, right? So, sorry, my husband's just walking in, excuse the noise. Like we always talk at Jonai about wanting to multiply rather than scale. And so that would be a form of growth, because it would be a growth of all of these, you know, small scale artisanal industries, in terms of there would just be more of us and the economy wouldn't actually halt. In fact, it would arguably flourish. But I think that for me, when I'm thinking about degrowth, I'm thinking about that kind of centralization of growth. So who gets to grow, you know, and I want to seed lots more farms everywhere and watch them all grow. And spread our risk in terms of the way we produce food, in terms of how we run our economies, and let more people flourish. And so I'm with you, I guess, on the growth ambivalence too, that maybe in the end, the economy in fact kind of grows, but I don't actually give a rat's about measuring it in those ways. You know, I want to measure how many people are benefiting from abundance.
Yeah, I mean, I do think we're all on the same page, and that's why I began that comment with framing, right? It's just about how we talk about these things, and do we want to be talking about shrinking things, or do we want to be talking about making things better? You know, because I think that's what we all want. We want a better life for people, and a more sustainable, and in fact, as I said before, regenerative. We've got to go beyond just sustainable. Actually, we've got to kind of repair the damage that we've done, and I think those are the goals to me.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Anitra, I missed that.
Well, that's why degrowthers talk about a life of quality versus quantity. It's not like we live in lots of quantity and we need now to be living in less quantity. The actual contrast and reverse of quantity is actually quality. And so that's our emphasis. And we definitely say that there would be lots of countries in the South and people who are disadvantaged in Australia whose basic needs need to be met. So they will actually be in a situation of growth in terms of what they're able to use, you know, from a degrowth point of view. And in our book on exploring degrowth, we actually say it would be ridiculous. It's as ridiculous to talk about degrowth for degrowth's sake as it is to talk about growth for growth's sake. But we actually do live in a society where there is growth for growth's sake. And the other thing is that, and the reason why the degrowth movement is so strong is that there are no operating systems in capitalism to degrow. So that you cannot have a steady state or a shrinking economy without having depressions and recessions and austerity and people kind of really paying. And this is part of a debt cycle, which would probably be part of a bigger conversation. But those are some of the kind of distinctions which, yeah, I agree. We're sort of pretty much on the same page because we're all looking at meeting everyone's basic needs, living within Earth's limits.
So, Vicky, I'm aware that you haven't had a chance to talk for a little while or to add to the conversation. I'm wondering what you'd like to add.
I'd love to add to that. I'm really enjoying the conversation. I spoke earlier about the value of how we feel, and I'm actually referring to Professor Julian Merrick from Flinders University. Continues to do some fantastic research into qualitative and quantitative measures around culture. And I'd really like to, when I talk about culture, I often talk about what we value, our sense of selves, our sense of belonging to place. It's not necessarily high C art on the wall or whatever. And so when we talk about growth or degrowth, are we only talking about that in monetary terms, or are we talking about other value sets? For example, and just to pick up on the commentary of quantitative versus qualitative measures. So, for example, our creative industries, they chase the metrics of the magic audience number, a full house, fantastic, great, you've got 430 odd people to your show. But you need context around that. It might have been a crap show. You might have 10 people to that show, but it's been a life-changing, life-affirming event that's impacting memory through time and future storytelling to your children beyond you. That's a different kind of value. And so it has to have context. Anything that we measure has to have context. And it's been the trap for the creative industries, arts and culture for the last 34 years, is trying to put a number on what things that make us feel good or feel bad or feel curious. And so it's really important that as we move forward, we talk about the quantitative. Thank you, Anitra.
Actually, Tim, I have a funny anecdote related to that. We were traveling in country New South Wales about a decade ago, and we were looking for somewhere to eat and couldn't, it was hard to decode what was going to be reasonable to eat in this little town. And we said, oh, that place is full. That's usually a good sign. And my daughter, who was about 6 at the time, said, yeah, Mum, by that equation, we should go to McDonald's because it's usually full too. And I was like, well said, kid. And she was right, by the way, it was terrible.
So in this conversation around, talking about, degrowth or circular economies or kind of lateral growth, it's interesting. One of the comments here is around saying, well, hang on a minute, are we really here about changing the world and avoiding global catastrophe? Or is there something different about preparing us as locals to be more resilient to survive the kind of inevitable change that seems to be happening with the environment, or that might happen with the global economy, et cetera, et cetera?
Can I answer that quickly? Yeah. I mean, my answer to that would be that, for instance, building an economy that's producing locally for use locally. And I mean, we've got really good examples around like Harcourt Organic Farming Cooperative. We have Wonderpants, lots of other kind of studios and enterprises at the Mill Complex. We've got Mount Alexander Sustainability Group with different solar and waste reduction projects and all of those kinds of things that are already happening. By increasing all of these kind of locally producing activities for local uses means that we don't have economic collapse when we have a coronavirus. We just have a coronavirus crisis, not the economic crisis. And we're also able to integrate all of those regenerative activities in our local area as well. Especially if we're only working 3 or 4 days a week at producing for our basic needs, we've got a couple of days where we can be working in planting trees and doing those kinds of things. So resilience and the kinds of ideas that we're talking about, I think, go hand in hand.
Warwick?
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's a great question because, I certainly feel that localisation and local production is a critical part of the solution to the situation that we're in. But I also think it's not sufficient. I think we need to be able to do both of those things at the same time. Actually, we need to be localising, and we need to be supporting, sustainable production in our local area. But if that's all we do, then we're going to get steamrolled by climate change and by corporate power and by corporate and private interests take over politics, and the decisions end up getting made in Melbourne instead of locally about how our land is used and all that kind of thing. So I think we need to be very active here to build resilience and to build our local community and community connections and deep connections with each other and with our place. But at the same time, we have to be politically active in order to, you know, deal with and contribute to some of those bigger issues. And politically active doesn't necessarily mean in the traditional sense, but, you know, we as a sort of localising movement should be linked up with other localising movements around the world. And, you know, localisation is only going to deal with the big picture things if it's happening all over the place. It's happening everywhere. It's not just us doing our localisation thing. So there's a sort of standard political movement, and then there's a kind of outreach connection to other places, you know, around the world. But ultimately, you know, climate change is extremely unlikely to be solved from the grassroots. The grassroots are going to push action and create the political will, but you know, I think it's extremely unlikely to be solved at that level. It's got to, as we've seen with the coronavirus, you know, there's been a dip in emissions with everybody basically staying at home, but it's been a dip, not a plunge. And there's kind of large-scale systemic issues that need to be addressed, and that happens, you know, large-scale political level, I think.
I'd love to contribute to that too, because I bang on a lot about the importance of collectivizing and organizing and turning the grassroots movements into global movements, like the ones that the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance is involved in. You know, we're members of La Via Campesina, which is the global network of peasants and indigenous peoples with over 300 million people who associate with La Via, and members of the International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty. And that is doing exactly the kind of work that you're talking about, Warwick, of connecting these very localized movements to have the global conversations. And that one of the conversations we've been having in the movement, in the food sovereignty movement, is that globalization got us into this mess, and internationalization is what's going to get us out of it. It's the internationalists who are, you know, activists all over the world having the conversations. I've been involved in Zooms, you know, that involve people from every part of the world, and talking about how they're solving problems in their little space, and how we all are linking up to, what's working with your government that won't work with this government. I mean, those kinds of discussions are critical if we're going to see the changes that we really need. But the beauty of being an activist like what all of us here are, is that we are doing that local work. We are growing a bunch of our own food. We are living, you know, the changes we wish to see, and we're linked up to others doing it as well, and figuring out the best ways to lobby for the massive policy reforms required to get us over the line.
Can I add as well to that, Tim, please? I think I really have been quite blown away by this community through isolation. It's been quite an exciting time. Just how the Shire, Mount Alexander Shire, continues to reveal the wealth and depths of talent and interest and altruism here. And I've certainly been feeling my privilege of late. We dodged a bullet where so many of our partners across the world don't even have the thinking space to have conversations like this, that's for sure. And so following on from about 2.5 years of scoping, in fact, when I first arrived in the Shire fresh, and I heard the words, when I said to everyone, tell me, what do you need? And I heard the word isolation more than I cared in that first month. And from then that set me on a path where we had a community of artists, but not an arts community. And to the point where we've got, through COVID-19, council approval to actually build a guild-like model for arts, cultural and creative industries, and that will be a very much localised, focused, cooperative working model for our community, exactly built to where in the past, you know, our internationally connected community, you know, gigs lost in Italy and Spain, all around the world, and let alone interstate. The focus became very quickly about our neighbours and our disconnected neighbours who had lost their connection to community, and the role of the arts, culture and creative industries to keep people socially connected, and that became a driving force of conversation very early on. And so the focus of that international, global scale and outreach and build the numbers and finance became about care for community overnight. And so in response to that, we've recognised again that need for cooperative working to safely emerge. And through that, building a new web application to have conversations, collectively around what are those resources that we need to build, and also provide and gift to other communities around the world who haven't had this thinking space. You know, there's data showing that this community here in the Shire has got the highest rate of creators and makers per capita in the state of Victoria. That's a unique natural resource that we have here that is not something we should be extracting, but farming. And that's very much been the approach of the community here. And I'm really excited about what's ahead for the community and that people need to have a play with that new modelling.
So one of our Commons, Castlemaine Commons person has posted a comment around, I think you addressed this a little bit before, Anitra, around, you know, that if we all kind of took a step back from our work and worked 3 or 4 days, then everybody could have work. But what about the, you know, unemployed, underemployed, those people? You know, I'm looking around at our Zoom currently, and what I see is a whole lot of middle class and very capable, educated people. You know, what happens for, you know, a whole range of people that have been so marginalised through generations? You know, what about how would degrowth kind of work with them? How would, or a circular economy or no growth or lateral growth, whatever we're talking about, how would they kind of be included and engaged in this kind of process?
I think you're assuming that people who are unemployed are unemployed for a good reason, because they haven't got skills and they haven't got knowledge, and that's not right. So if we shared the work, those people would come into workplaces and they would get the normal kind of training, on work training that anyone else would get. And in terms of just looking around people and just kind of assuming what their backgrounds are, I spent 10 years on a disability support pension, and the rest of my life I've worked part-time mainly. So it's kind of like not the typical. And I think one of the problems is that we perhaps don't know enough about what people's real backgrounds are and how these kinds of things might function. But if you look at and different cooperative models and whatever, there are much easier ways of integrating people in and on the job training kind of skills. So I lived in a kind of at common ground, which is sort of like a commune, a collective, but sort of all working, all living cooperative. And there and in other similar places where I've lived, people come in and everyone has skills. Everyone has some kind of skills. We've all had lots of school training and developed all kinds of other skills outside of school or whatever. And then there's a lot of sharing of knowledge and sharing of skills. So that's what we have to be good at as well. Because I think that we actually live in a very competitive kind of mainstream capitalist culture, is sort of like very much, oh, you can't do something and there must be a reason why you're unemployed or whatever. And that's actually often not the case, that someone actually really hasn't had the opportunity. And that's why we go for sharing work, because it actually means that no one is left in a situation where they lack confidence because they haven't been doing work for the last couple of years or whatever.
Yeah. Warwick?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Anitra about all of that. And I also, though, think it's not the only, sharing work is not the only way to achieve full employment. There's actually no shortage of work that needs doing. There's so much we could be doing, especially in terms of repairing environmental damage and restoring a natural environment. There's a huge amount of work that could be done. It's just that there currently aren't paid jobs to do those things. And again, going back to the very beginning of this show, where we talked about the contrast between now and the Keynesian era, in Australia for 25 years following World War II, we averaged 2% unemployment. And especially at the end of the war, if you were unemployed, you could just turn up at a rail yard or Parks and Gardens and be given a job by the government, basically on the spot. And the government, and that was an intentional government policy, was to achieve full employment, to just spend enough to fill the spare capacity in the economy so that everybody who wanted a job had one. And I mean, I totally agree with Anitra. We should all be working less, right? The full-time work hours should absolutely be less to give people more time to engage with their families, with their communities, to be politically engaged. For all of those reasons, I think we need to pick up the campaign where the 40-hour week left off and push it down to 30 and then keep going from there. And we can definitely do that. You know, we can afford to do that. But I also think it's important to know that there isn't sort of certain amount of work that there is out there to be done. It's really about, it's about the financing and the money and who gets paid to do what. Because of course there is already an enormous amount of unpaid work done in our communities, disproportionately done by women. That's still work just because you're not being paid. So I guess I just wanted to add to that mix that the government could at any time achieve full employment, but they choose not to. And that was the transition that happened again in the 1970s when neoliberalism took over. The government abandoned its commitment to full employment in the name of controlling inflation. So our unemployment level is 5% considered full employment, and that's an intentional policy. So regardless of what we say about the unemployed, they're sort of being used as a policy tool for managing the economy.
And yet the rhetoric is all about it's their responsibility. That's
right.
And Tim, can I pick up on that, because I loved Anitra's comment about, you know, the assumption that there's a lack of skills or resources there in unemployment. I'm really interested in looking trauma in the face at the moment. It's what we're all collectively experiencing in our highly individualistic way, but that, you know, Warwick's there spoken about Second World War outcomes and how we actually face up to these traumas at a collective but also an individual level and start asking those questions about why are people disconnected from the workforce. And so we were very fortunate recently. I know Castlemaine Commons fabulous lady Alex Kelly through the West End Resilience Network, and we were so very fortunate to have Craig Lapsley, the first Emergency Services Commissioner, come and speak to us directly and give us his insights about community organising and activation. And he spoke so very beautifully about letting the quiet, unseen people lead and mapping the resources that are available there. And so, yes, we're obviously thinking about the volunteer resourcing and the underpayment there, but I'm more interested in actually the people who are completely disconnected. And through the COVID-19 crisis, there's a sense that we're all kind of lost, you know, and flailing here, but actually there's an opportunity through that to rediscover new ways, or not rediscover, discover completely new ways of thinking and operating economically, socially and culturally. And so how do we reach deep into our communities and access and speak to and enable those resources by addressing trauma? I think it's a really interesting space.
Tammi?
I think I would probably just add to the aspect of the conversation about reducing work hours and rethinking what we mean by the need to work, and why do we have such needs to work as much as we do? What's the capitalist system and the debt that is a part and parcel of that system making us do in terms of our work needs? And we have some great examples in the local community of those who are trying to work largely in a non-monetary economy, and their labor is more about, you know, keeping their home in the domestic economy. And I think that if you can exit the formal workforce and do more bartering and foraging and looking after your own needs, then it's a totally different society that kind of emerges. And the question of leaving anyone behind, the idea is actually we all go back to much more self and community sufficiency and less requirement to be in formal paid employment. I think that's a worthy ambition, and peasant traditions, peasant communities all over the world still work in that way, where it's largely what's considered a subsistence lifestyle, and then the surplus is what's sold. And I think that we're not very good at thinking about living and working in those ways in countries like Australia, but they're worth thinking of in terms of the future we're looking for. I know that for us, a very privileged positive of the pandemic has been that we do so much of this in our lives, of the growing of our own needs and bartering with others for the things they grow. And so we've just been able to do more of that because we can't go anywhere. And we're not unhappy about the growing more food aspect of this.
Yeah. And I'm aware that the pandemic affects people differently.
Absolutely.
It's, you know, unlike the government saying that we're all in this together, there are a lot of people who aren't in here, who aren't in this together because they live in very, very difficult or complex circumstances, that they don't always have, some of the resources or, including capability. So it's challenging. We've got one more question to answer before we go to kind of what next. And it's around the universal basic income. I think a lot of people are hoping that with the government kind of giving extra money and saying all of this, that this will turn into some idea of a universal basic income. What do you think about that? I mean, is there a likelihood? Do you think it should happen? Yeah. What are your thoughts about that? Have I just thrown such a big question? I apologise to all of you.
I can have a quick crack at it if you like. I think there's a lot of appeal in the ideas about a universal basic income, but it's sort of problematic, particularly in the current political environment. I don't think there's any chance that we're on the cusp of the provision of a universal income to everyone, and I'm not entirely convinced at this point that it's desirable. I think there definitely should be a guaranteed basic level of income, that keeps people out of poverty. And I like the idea of, the provision of universal basic services, so people are guaranteed a house to live in, a roof over their head. They're guaranteed enough food to eat. But I think the idea that the government is going to give enough money to everyone to, live a reasonable life anytime soon is extremely unlikely. And I think the sort of version of there's one kind of version of the universal basic income which is about solving the problem of automation and computers taking over everybody's jobs. And what will people do? And there won't be enough work for everyone. I think for one thing, it's kind of a myth that there won't be enough work for everyone. As I was saying before, there's always things to do. There's always work. But I also think that if there are, a certain proportion of people who have paid employment and then another set of the population who are being given a universal basic income, then it's a recipe for a two-tiered society. Those who are kind of useful to the economy and those who are not. And that's obviously something to be very wary of.
We already have in terms of that, we don't recognise the care and the other kind of activities, or, what's privileged is something that brings in money, and that's productive.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. We already have a multi-tiered society anyway, in terms of those who own capital and make their money from that, versus those who are workers, versus those who don't have paid employment and all that.
Yeah.
So of course we already have that, but we don't need to create a new one.
Yeah.
Might be more realistic to be proposing a maximum income. So people aren't allowed to earn more than a certain amount of money. And I think that would bring about massive change.
Yes, here.
Love it.
Yeah.
Oh no, I was just going to talk about in terms of, we're here to talk about alternative economies, and I think one very appealing alternative way of running things is running businesses run by workers. So worker-owned cooperatives as a different way of doing things, and as a way that puts some constraints on a lot of these things. Where there's genuine capacity to talk about work-life balance and sustainable work hours, as well as kind of executive pay at the top, and all these things that become much more straightforward and much more plausible in a situation where everybody who works in a business owns the business, and has a say and has control.
So we're getting near to the end of the show, and I realise that we're 9 o'clock and we're going slightly over, but I guess I'm interested in a really kind of key take-home statement from each of you, and a kind of question around, you know, what we need to be thinking of and where we can take action, either personally, at a community level and politically, and or. I might start with you, Tammi, because I keep on starting with the left of my screen and I realise that's, you know, unfair.
It's so weird because when you say that, you're looking down at Anitra and I'm over here on the left.
Yes.
I mean, look, for me, when I think of alternative economies, obviously as a CSA farmer, the one I'm most committed to is solidarity economies, where people commit to each other in really meaningful ways, especially around food production and consumption. And so I think if you can, if you're not already buying directly from a farmer, then find one who you can, if at all possible, obviously. And if you can find one with a CSA where you can commit to them for a season or a year through thick and thin, and they commit back to you through thick and thin, I think that that's the kind of thing that's going to really change everything, really.
Thank you. Vicky?
Just picking up, I think, on Tammi's comments there, I think we're so very fortunate in Central Victoria to have a real value set for collectivism, you know, solidarity economies. And I think that we need to step up our game in advocacy and lobbying for that. You know, we are actually an admired community, and whilst we're all very kind of happy in our fabulous bubble, I really believe that we have a role to play in helping define that collective value. And helping to shape how we perhaps monetize it, but essentially that definition and again that qualification rather than quantification of value, and that narrative is a really important space for our community to play, I think, right now.
Great. Warwick?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the real take home is. Perhaps though that you know, these moves towards localisation to me are really critical. But again, to restate that we need to join with others doing the same things, and just a consciousness, I guess, that in this conversation there are so many things that we have either touched on extremely lightly or we haven't brought up. You know, alternative currencies, you know, creating a local currency, that kind of thing that we perhaps, you know, we obviously have to save for another show. We just barely scratched the surface of the economic system or the problems with the current one, or the, you know, the great realm of alternatives, but we do need an alternative economic system, I think, that's coherent, some level agreement across progressives and is well championed. And it's only when we build that we'll be capable of doing what the neoliberals did in the 1970s, which was step into a crisis with a clear solution to the crisis. That's kind of well politically championed, et cetera, et cetera. You know, that we don't have that right now. We don't have a coherent alternative system waiting in the wings, which means there won't be any radical change as a result of this crisis, just like there wasn't with the financial crisis, because, you know, all the political parties and all the people with political power effectively hold the same view. You know, there's differences here and there, of course, and some of those are important differences, but in terms of kind of radical change of the system,
we don't have those kind of options happening
yet.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anitra?
I think picking up on some of the things that Warwick has been talking about, I mean, I think that Castlemaine Commons in itself is one of those efforts that's really trying to address people coming together and discussing, exploring, you know, arguing about what the different ways we could go forward, what the feasibility of different futures are, being really concerned that our youth do have a future and that they will live in a world where we will reach sustainability and a balance with nature again. So very sort of community-based oriented economies. And, you know, many things, the organics, the degrowth, these are all international movements. And there's a lot of politics of values that are networked that sort of are quite underground, but are quite strong in a whole variety of ways. So I think that there's, despite the bushfires that we've had to face, this pandemic, I think that we've got a momentum now. It's much clearer that there are big problems that we have to face and that we will face these together. We've got the muscle, we can do it.
Thank you. Tammi, you've got a few things you want to mention.
I just thought we'd be remiss while we're talking about collectivizing in the region in particular, not to mention the Central Victorian Mutual Aid Group that's formed, that is seeking to link together all the many wonderful efforts already being done in the region by a number of localized groups. And there's a Slack platform if people want to join it. I think maybe in the YouTube, maybe Emma or Tim could share the link to that. I think you have it, Tim.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would say, I saw the comment that people would love another show or 5 on economics. And the Food Sovereignty Alliance is actually commencing a series on solidarity economies as of next Wednesday night. So if you look at the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance's Facebook page, you'll see it advertised there. It's on Eventbrite as well. Next week, we're looking at CSAs. And then the week after that, we'll be looking at collaborative economies with Open Food Network, probably leading the discussion about ways to collaborate with others to form new alternative economies.
So thank you, everybody. I know that we've just touched on this really, really lightly, and I would have liked to have gone into a whole lot more, but I think there's certainly, clearly people are interested in more shows or more interviews around this kind of stuff, so we can talk about much more alternative economies. But I think it's kind of time that we finish up the show, unfortunately. To our audience, Castlemaine Commons is always open to feedback and input around what we could do differently, what we can keep the same, different directions we can take, and everything like that. So please get in touch with us and let us know what we can do differently and what we can keep the same. Next week we have our week 6 show will be called A Just Transition, and the following week, Creatives and Art. I'd like to thank all our presenters tonight. We have many conversations before we get to this point. They've given up their time, and it's just been really wonderful. I've really enjoyed listening to everybody tonight and also the other conversations we've had. So I'd like to thank Anitra Nielsen, Warwick Smith, Tammi Jonas, and Vicky Anderson. Thank you so much for the conversation. And I'd also like to thank the great people behind Castlemaine Commons. So the wonderful Emma King, the workhorse Natalie Moxham, the thinker Matt Aboud. I'm running out of adjectives, I'm failing here. But anyway, I'm just going to have to go with the rest. So I apologise for everybody. Jesse Boyland, Declan Ferber-Gillick, who has really been a great addition, and so has Kath Koff, and of course, Alex Kelly. I'd like to thank you for watching Castlemaine Commons and invite your friends to see this show on YouTube if they didn't catch it live. We will actually finish with a short video about insane trade. And this is exactly some of the stuff that we've kind of been hinting at tonight. Great, let's go to the video.
Tim.
Thanks.
Thank you.
A Scottish fishing trawler returns from the North Sea with its catch.
Oi, Captain, can I buy some of your fish?
Sorry, mister. But first the fish have to be shipped to China to be cleaned. Once they're shipped back, then you can buy some.
China? Yeah. A 10,000-mile return trip? Right. That's insane. Yeah.
Meanwhile, a busy environmental organization gets some troubling news.
one column had 3-line bank.
Get a load of this, boss.
Well, I'll be. Listen to this. We import over 300,000 tons of potatoes in a year.
I guess we need potatoes, right?
Then why do we export almost the same amount? What? Same thing with sugar, beef, and lots of other foods. And we're not the only country doing this. Look what's happening in the UK.
Yeah, what the heck?
Makes no sense, does it?
Looks like another case of insane trade.
Oh, must be they don't believe in climate change, do they?
I can't believe it.
On a lonely country road, a young man wrestles with his demons.
Mary's right. I've been a real sap about food. I bought corporate, global food because it was cheaper. Now I see it's only cheaper because of subsidies and tax breaks that we all pay for, including me. And that's not all. The global food system is killing rural life, ruining small farmers like Mary's dad. I tell you, I had it figured all wrong. Now that I know the score, I see how insane global food is. I promise you, Mary, from now on, I'm only buying local food.
I love you, Jack.